All right. Good day, everyone. I think we can slowly start. We are still missing MAHNAZ ZAHIRINEJAD, so maybe she will just join a little bit later, but I think we should be starting already since time is always limited when it comes to such a huge topic. First of all, thank you very much to our experts to participate today in the discussion on the topic, will the negotiations on the Iran nuclear agreement in Vienna be successful? I think there's a lot to discuss. We all know that in July 2015, the Jcpoa, after already long negotiations between the P5+1 and the European Union, entered into force. So the idea actually was that the dispute over the Iranian nuclear program seemed to be solved diplomatically, at least for a while. That's what we see right now. However, we all remember also that then the Trump administration already in the election campaign was claiming that this deal, the so-called Iran deal, is the worst deal ever. And in May 2008, then the US unilaterally withdrew from the Jcpoa, how the nuclear deal is called. Tensions afterwards rose high, and the danger of military escalation between the US and Iran became obvious when the US drone was shut down in 2019. Other incidents, like the seizure of an Iranian oil tanker in the Persian Gulf, further escalated the situation. However, with the election of Joe Biden as new president of the United States, the idea of getting back to the Jcpoa was revived, and discussions in Vienna started again in 2020. When we were talking about to organize this webinar, we actually already thought that maybe today the agreement will already be resumed. According to most international observers, the talks on the revival of the agreement on Iran's nuclear program are in the final phase. Much already has been agreed upon. However, still hurdles still remain. 3 working groups have been set up to negotiate which sanctions on Iran will be lifted and how Iran will return to its commitment of the original Jcpoa of 2015. Our experts now will discuss the course of the negotiations in Vienna and also the interests of the different partners. The talks will, as I already mentioned, resume this week. So I look forward to a very interesting discussion. My name is Stephanie FENKART. I'm the director of the International Institute for Peace. So we are organizing this event, but I would like to thank, of course, HEINZ GÄRTNER, who is our chair of our advisory board, who came up with the idea. I would like to especially welcome, of course, Ambassador ASGHAR SOLTANIEH. He's the former Iran's ambassador and permanent representative to Vienna and Geneva-based international organizations in Vienna. So welcome. He will speak in his personal capacity, but we all know that you have a very long career. I will then also like to welcome Mr. Stephen Herzog. He's a senior researcher in nuclear arms control at the Center of Security Studies at the ETH in Zurich. And he's also a research fellow at the project on managing the atom at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I will introduce MAHNAZ once she's here, but also, again, HEINZ GÄRTNER is going to be our last speaker today. He's a professor of political science at the University of Vienna and Krems and the chair of the advisory board of the IIP. My name is Stephanie FENKART. I'm the director of the IIP. I will lead through the discussion. And I would also already like to tell all our participants, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A sections. I will go through them in the discussion. So please also try to be precise, since I'm not able to read very, very long text while listening to what our speakers are saying. Let me now start with you, Mr. Soltanieh. I would be interested in your perspective on the process now of coming back to the Jcpoa. What is especially important for Iranians? What are also the obstacles? And what is the difference to 2015 when the Jcpoa entered into force? We also talked a little bit before about the momentum, since we also know that there are Iranian elections upcoming. So please, the next 10 to 12 minutes are yours, and then I look forward to a discussion between all the participants and all the speakers. So the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I want to thank the IIP, the prestigious think tank in Vienna, inviting me, and thank you for coordinating. As you correctly said, I'm speaking on my personal behalf. Can you hear me? Yes, on my personal behalf. In order to deal with the issue at the latest development, we have to make sure short review perhaps about the main elements which has had an impact on the whole process in order to better understand where we were in 2015 and what is the difference now, and what are the elements which have the impact on the final result. I try to be very briefly enumerate some of the principal elements that might have a direct impact. First of all, Iran, with 1,000 years of civilization, is opted for dialogue. It is in DNA of Iranian. We want dialogue, and we prefer dialogue to confrontation. This is a principal, important element that we should not lose sight. Next point is, at the same time, because of these 1,000 years of civilization, we have national pride and attach great importance to the dignity, and we will not yield to pressure. This is, again, in our DNA. Therefore, whoever speaks with us in an uncivilized language of carrot stick that you have heard a lot, sanction, pressure, negotiation, these are, in fact, counterproductive, and it proved in many cases that delayed this sort of realization of JCPOA for a long time. 12 years we were negotiating. And whenever they talk about pressure, it was counterproductive, and it jeopardized, in fact, the environment. JCPOA is manifestation of multilateral diplomacy after years of negotiation. And we have all, international community have to respect and try to safeguard it as one of the, in fact, results of this process. It was realized because Obama administration recognized the legitimate right, which is envisaged, of course, in Article 4 of NPT, right for enrichment of Islamic Republic of Iran, and also use the somehow decent language, civilized language compared to previous administration. And therefore, that paved the way for JCPOA. However, Trump administration, by withdrawing from JCPOA, in fact, calling all agreements by his predecessor as disaster, was disaster. And I said it in other international organizations and conferences that this is a clear indication that there is anarchy in the hierarchy of United States, because they have to respect the, in fact, agreement, multilateral, bilateral, even if the previous administration has done. I want to recall all distinguished viewers that after the revolution, I was in Atomic Energy Organization before and after. Although the NPT was signed and ratified during Shah, but we try to respect it as international treaty. How come an administration is changed and disregard all international agreements and they call it disaster? It means as if that nothing has happened and disregard to international multilateral process and approach. The next important point, of course, is that Iran was fully committed and complied with the JCPOA as the IAEA continuously reported. Therefore, we are committed to it. I want to add also another important element. Islamic Republic of Iran is based on Islamic school of thought, and this is important for a Muslim or Islamic Republic of Iran that if they have a committed, they should be committed. They cannot have a non-compliance to any international commitment. And this is part of our, in fact, teachings. Therefore, you can get indication that if there is an agreement, even now, after this negotiation in Vienna, whatever is the agreement, no matter who will come to the office after election, Islamic Republic of Iran will be committed to whatever is committed for and comply with as one of the international agreements. Therefore, we respect it. The next point, of course, is Iran has, of course, exercised maximum vigilance after Trump's withdrawal, as this government, our government, call it 1 year of strategic patience. And of course, you understand that even after that, we tried to use a legal, in fact, right under the JCPOA Article 36 to gradually reduce some of those voluntary, in fact, commitments. And still we are in the JCPOA, and still the work is going on. However, in the meantime, some developments has had impact. The terror of our nuclear scientist, Dr. Fakhrizadeh, and the sabotage, all these hostile activities by from different corners has had a negative impact on the environment. And of course, the new parliament decided to pass a law to make sure that we are not in vicious cycle anymore. And therefore, we have to know whether the sanction will be removed. Then we can permit US to come back to JCPOA, and also we will be ready to go back to our full compliance. In that direction, therefore, negotiation of Vienna, of course, started. Iran, of course, has had always political will for amicable solution, and that's why the negotiation in Vienna is going on. I personally believe, and some of the also analysts believe, that there was no need for negotiation to Vienna, to be very, in fact, frank, because the position of Iran is very clear. If the sanctions imposed by Trump all are removed, and then we will verify those, verifying the removal of those sanctions and impact, then Iran is ready to go back where we were. And then, of course, US will be able to come back to JCPOA, and everything will be on right track. However, again, Iran proved once again the political will in order to respect the others, in order to somehow give an affirmative response to requests by EU and other members, existing members, 4+1 of JCPOA, and came to Vienna. It was a very hard decision to come to negotiation for doing something which is trivial. They have to remove the sanctions. However, you are following, of course, the discussion. I don't want to put it in detail. There have been, again, concession and compromise and trying to find amicable solution at the end of the day. And we hope that if the US administration, Biden administration, that unfortunately wasted a lot of time, I'm sure that all international analysts also agree with me that Biden administration wasted at least 2 months at the beginning, not paying attention to this important matter. And during these 2 months, many international developments even worsened the environment for somehow the negotiated solution. However, despite of that, I think that I have to have a couple of personal assessment and warning. Yes, we still hope that everything goes back, but we should be very careful not to have wishful thinking or expectation, not coping with the reality. If Biden administration cope itself with the reality on the ground and the fact that maximum pressure by Trump has failed, and if Trump administration, the Biden administration will condemn and criticize all actions, conduct, and actions by Trump administration, which damaged a lot to the Iranian people, and express its determination to compensate those damages, it will create a new positive environment, which gives a possibility for sort of faster and long sustainable solution. And in saying so, at the same time, I warn that if they make a miscalculation by continuing the pressure and the heritage of Trump as a leverage, this is a serious miscalculation. In that case, I'll dare to say that I will not rule out that they will push JCPOA to disappear. We have to be very careful. And I advise them not to miscalculate. They can learn the lesson of 2006, that when we came to a point that enough is enough, 2,200 in fact, individuals at that time, and then become 2,000. And after 2.5 years of suspension, additional protocol, still EU3 was unable to remove the agenda from Board of Governors. Then we broke all the seals and we step up. And again, the same thing might happen again. Therefore, let's hope that the wisdom would prevail in Washington. And of course, in EU, EU have tried their best, but they, of course, have passed miscalculation and mistakes. And I hope that EU will compensate also, and we will be able to see that everything is on right track. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soltanieh, for this very concise description of how you perceive what is going on right now. And I think you already mentioned some very important topics that you said Iran would be open for dialogue. The maximum pressure didn't work. And of course, also trust in multilateral agreements has been quite challenged, I would say, with the withdrawal of the US from the Jcpoa. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Herzog, maybe to reflect on what Mr. Soltanieh has been saying, but probably also explaining a little bit, how do you assess the US on generally on this armament discussion? We know they have this deterrence policy, but how do they also profit from the Jcpoa? And what is multilateral agreements today for the US administration? But please feel free to react also to what Mr. Soltanieh had been saying. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Stephanie, and thanks as well to the IIP and to Professor Gärtner for hosting. And it's great to be on this panel as well and to listen to the remarks of Ambassador Soltanieh, which are very thought-provoking. I have some reflections as I'll go along on this, and probably not as concise as him, possibly not as elegant as him, but we'll go through. And what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about kind of the perspective of US government officials and analysts as far as their interest, as far as the prospects for successful negotiation, and a little bit of thoughts kind of moving forward. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, came up that you asked in this question is essentially, you know, what does the United States get from the Jcpoa? And one of the interesting questions is why does this matter at all to the Biden administration on some different levels? The Biden administration, if you look at it, has shown already an interest in drawing down the American troop presence in the Middle East. And if you look at the Biden administration staffers in different agencies, we'll say the Pentagon, the State Department, the national security staff, the Biden administration actually has substantially fewer permanent staffers dedicated to the Middle East than the Obama administration did. And for the Biden administration, you know, they're very interested in getting the nuclear issue off the table as a sticking point with Iran. And the main interest and focus is dealing with Iran's sponsorship of proxy groups in the Middle East that the United States has designated as terrorist organizations, and particularly dealing with the provision of rockets and precision munitions to said groups. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, as far as my understanding and officials I've talked to on some level establish a more neutral baseline with Iran than we've seen in recent years, much more so than we've seen from the Trump administration. I don't think we're headed towards normalization at any point, but maybe something more closely approximating the US situation with Venezuela, or even more recently with Lebanon, where it's not exactly overtly confrontational. And we know from the time during the Jcpoa that while the Jcpoa is in force, we saw a reduction in reported cyber incidents between the states, we saw a reduction in incidents at sea, and we saw some general discussions about building grounds for the future. Now, one of the other things you also talked about, Stephanie, was arms control. And that is as we know, the Trump administration, and I think very regrettably, pulled out of the INF Treaty, they pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty, they unsigned the Arms Trade Treaty. And one of the things is for as much as members of the Biden administration and their State Department talk about possible Russian violations as these treaties for justifications of not going back into the treaties that I mentioned before, I don't really think it's about that. I think they generally lack the votes in the US Senate to return to such treaties. The Jcpoa is different because it's an executive agreement. It's something that the Biden administration can actually do within the realm of arms control and nonproliferation. But there are hurdles, and I have a couple different views on them. One hurdle is procedural, and that is that the diplomacy, as I'm sure that many people know, which is happening right now, is shuttle diplomacy with Enrique Mora's team from the EU going back and forth between luxury hotels, between the Iranian and the US delegations, because the Iranian delegation has not had an interest in talking directly to the US delegation. I think that procedurally, this probably slows things down a little bit. Additionally, something else we'll talk about is it seems to be, at least in the assessment of US analysts and officials, that it's unlikely that there will be an agreement with Iran before the upcoming Iranian election. But more important that we need to recognize and just be honest about is the JCPOA is very politically controversial in the United States. And there's a long legacy of hawks in the United States who don't share the same positions that I share or others share, opposing diplomacy with Iran. As you mentioned, Trump was on TV in the United States for 4 years as president, saying that this is the worst deal ever and saying that he had done a great thing by moving out. I'm also a public opinion polling specialist, and I've done polling in the United States on these issues. And polling I've done fairly recently says 54% of Americans don't want to be in the JCPOA, 46% do. And it's very split among political lines. Democrats want to be in the JCPOA, Republicans don't. Independents are generally leaning towards not wanting to be in it. So it's politically polarized. However, other polling I've done shows us that 80% of Americans say they want peace with Iran and they don't want military conflict with Iran. Now, when we talk about peace with Iran, no military conflict, and returning to the JCPOA, there are some technical hurdles as too. And one thing that Ambassador Soltani didn't mention in his presentation is the decisions that Iran made to reverse on certain provisions of the JCPOA after the Trump administration pulled out in 2018. I very much understand why Iran did these things, or at least I think I have my own reading of why Iran did this, and we can talk about this. So I think, the increase in centrifuges exceeding the 300 kilogram limit on uranium enriched to 3.67%, both quantitatively and qualitatively, exceeding the heavy water stocks. I think the reason why Iran did these things is I think because these are easily reversible things. And I think my read is that Iran is trying to show the Americans and show the Europeans, hey, these are the consequences when you don't abide by the JCPOA. That's my reading. But I think in Washington that decision by the Iranians, if that was the case, was a miscalculation. And I think because whether it's intentional or not, what Iran does when it does those things is it's decreasing its breakout time to the bomb, particularly when we talk about highly enriched uranium with 60% isotope U-235 or higher that doesn't really have a whole lot of civil scientific applications. And I think that makes sanctions relief much more difficult. And this all matters because of the political contention. The United States is not going to withdraw all of these sanctions while Iran has done these things which reduce its breakout time to get to the bomb. So what we've been talking about and what they've been talking about in Vienna is packages and a compliance for compliance approach and reducing the sanctions as some of these decisions by Iran were reduced. And one of the issues that we have right now, besides sequencing and packages, is it looks like that some small amount of US sanctions on Iran are going to remain, perhaps dealing with IRGC members. And so as a result, my understanding is that Iran now is not willing to destroy advanced centrifuges as a result of this. And so Iran may be willing to move them off site, which then becomes another question for the United States of, will the IAEA have off-site oversight of centrifuges that are moved out of Natanz and Fordo? And the other issue, of course, that remains for the United States is Iran's recent inability to account for chemically processed uranium particles at undeclared sites. And this isn't really helping anything. Now, all these kind of negative things said, I am optimistic. And I do think that we will see a return to the JCPOA this summer. The read of most American analysts that I've talked to, though, is that we don't see it happening generally until after the Iranian election on June 18th. And the read, at least that the Americans have, and perhaps Professor Gärtner and our Ambassador Soltani can correct us on this, is our read is that we think it's most likely to happen in the lame duck session once Rouhani's successor has been elected, but Rouhani remains in power towards the end of his term. And we think there's a few different reasons for this. One, it's probably too politically contentious in Iran before an election to have this type of major foreign policy action. Two, hardliners, including the frontliner, Ibrahim Raisi, probably aren't going to do it and move back to the JCPOA. And 3 is that Rouhani has an interest as part of his legacy of essentially returning to the JCPOA, and the sanctions relief would be a win for the supreme leader and for Iran's leadership. And future issues regarding the JCPOA that might manifest could essentially be blamed on the former government rather than the future government. So what will we get? And on the US side, our thought, at least what I'm seeing in all the statements and everything, is it's very clear. The goal is to return to the status quo ante. And there have been a lot of analysts that have said, Iran might be very scared about returning to the JCPOA with the United States because maybe Biden's successor comes along and wants to just pull out again. And I think the Iranians have a lot of good reasons to be very skeptical for that. And so some analysts have talked about, could this be a formal treaty? Could this go before the US Congress to present more obstacles to a future US president pulling out? And this might reassure Iran. But at the same time, I think that is incredibly unlikely to get approval in the United States for a formal treaty or congressional approval, because of the population of Republicans in Congress who would probably want provisions such as a clause saying no enrichment at all for Iran. And obviously, given what Ambassador Soltani said and what we know about Article 4 of the NPT, this is going to be a non-starter in Iran. And the other issue that we can talk a little bit more, I have more notes written down, but I'll try and be kind of concise and finish up here soon, is it doesn't look like at this time that there is likely to be follow-on. And the United States has emphasized the need to focus on Iran's ballistic and cruise missile programs, and also Iran's sponsorship of certain proxies and its kind of more regional interest. And we can talk a little bit about that, about what is plausible or not plausible, whether in a second round or the Q&A. But I think overall, I think that both the United States and Iran at this point seem very amenable to a return to the status quo ante, to the JCPOA, probably 2015. But I think there are a few important things if that actually happens. One is, I think that it will be very important for Tehran not to use sanctions relief in a way that might increase provocative regional activities. But I also personally think that Washington and the Biden administration need to get a handle on Israel and the Netanyahu administration to prevent these types of provocative cyber attacks like that on Natanz, because that's just going to be further disruptive to diplomacy and the JCPOA. So happy to talk more and have many more thoughts on future follow-on and things like that. But I do think we'll see a return to the JCPOA in previous form. Obviously, we need to get there first, and I think we're probably all in agreement that this is likely to happen in the next few weeks and provide us with a baseline for some normalcy. But then I think the even harder work starts after the JCPOA, once we've obtained normalcy. The question is, first JCPOA, then what? Because the general status quo between the United States and Iran generally isn't sustainable, and I don't think it's in either country's interest. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very comprehensive analysis. I'm pretty sure that Mr. Soltanieh would like then to say something about it. But before, I would also like to mention that MAHNAZ contacted me. It seems that she has problems with her internet connection, so she will try still to connect, but until now, she didn't manage. It would be interesting because she also tackles a lot on the sanctions and on the economic issue, and also what it means for the Iranians living in the country, since sanctions actually also affect everyday life of ordinary Iranians. But now let's go to HEINZ. HEINZ, I think after all you heard, I mean, you have been following the process in Vienna. I know that quite closely. And maybe it's also interesting what Mr. Soltanieh said, that he said that Vienna negotiations, they actually were not really even necessary because we could just go back. You know, that is the idea. But we also heard about from Stephen Herzog, I mean, there are procedural and technical hurdles. There is a question about what are the political compromises, since we know it's not only about technical situation. You also said, I mean, the missile discussion has been hugely on the topic as well in recent years. So HEINZ, my question to you would be, if you can speculate what will happen in the next weeks, what are the political compromises, and how's the relation between sanctions and duties Iran will have to fulfill, and how will the negotiations continue? Maybe also in line with what was said, that there are upcoming Iranian elections now in June. So please, HEINZ, the floor is yours, and let's hope that MAHNAZ still manages to connect herself.
Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating it. I want also to thank the International Institute for Peace for organizing this timely event. I very much hope that MAHNAZ will come back, because that's all about what will be the economic impact if the Jcpoa will be restarted and re-implemented. So that is a very, very important question, which I skip in my presentation. So that's, I'm waiting for MAHNAZ to do it. Stephanie, yes, I will speculate. Speculation is based also on information. So as you said, I'm almost every second day before one of those what Stephen called luxury hotels, where the negotiations take place in the Grand Hotel, to get out bits and pieces of information by the delegates. But I also talk to journalists, which are plenty there, especially coming from the Middle East. So a lot has been achieved, and I agree with Stefan. We will have an agreement in the next couple of weeks. It will be not as easy as Ambassador Soltanieh said. It's not a strike of the pen, as we already can see. I will speak about what has been agreed upon and what might be the result. Of course, these are all my interpretations and observations, because there's no final Jcpoa yet. So this is the 6th round of talks. Maybe there will be a 7th one. Also, at the end, if there is an agreement, there has to be a meeting on the level of foreign ministers to come back to approve the new agreement. Many bilateral and multilateral meetings have taken place already in Vienna, and there have been several plenary sessions. Draft texts have been exchanged already, and all sides say that there's something, some urgency here to come to an agreement. So, because Stephanie asks what is the interest of the parties involved, Stephen was already expanding on this. The interest of the United States is because they saw that Iran is making progress towards nuclear weaponize its nuclear program. So to some extent, Iran was successful in order to bring the United States to the negotiations. But also there is not often mentioned as a China factor, because there is an rapprochement between Iran and China, and there is this comprehensive agreement between Iran and China. And so the West is thinking we cannot leave Iran entirely to the influence of China, and to get somehow Iran back to the Western economy as well, which might happen with the Jcpoa. And also there is a window of opportunity, as it was in 2015, when Rouhani and Obama thought it was important to get an agreement in time. That's why they were sitting in another hotel and extending the negotiations for weeks in order to come to an agreement before this window of opportunity will be closed. Iran, of course, has an interest in lifting sanctions to get its economy going as well. And talking about the Iranian elections, I do think also the possible successor of President Rouhani has an interest. He will be the beneficiary of the sanctions relief. So Rouhani will remain with the legacy, and his successor will get the economic benefits. So there is likely that they will not leave the Jcpoa if there is an agreement. And of course, the European Union, there's some reputation at stake. Very lately, the European Union discovered that it has a responsibility and organized the meetings of the joint sessions. The European Union is chairing these joint sessions, and it has started after presidential candidate Biden announced that he might go back to the Jcpoa, immediately after that, the European Union would set up a virtual meeting in December 2020, where there was an agreement to go back to the original Jcpoa, not talking about the side issues, missiles and behavior and that one. And there was another meeting beginning of April, and then to start with technical talks, which started in April 7. So it's something at stake for the European Union. If the talks fail, the European Union and the Joint Commission will fail as well. And then where we are, where did the delegation start? So at the beginning, both sides started with a maximal opposition. So Iran wanted the US to lift all the sanctions before it gets back to its commitments of the original Jcpoa, and the US wanted Iran to go back to the original commitments before it started to lift sanctions. So that was not feasible. Then there was this debate about sequencing. So step by step, this was a sort of chicken game. Who starts first? So soon both delegations found out that's not possible either. You cannot have a cumbersome, painstakingly step-by-step sequencing approach. So I will come back to this a little bit later for a possible solution. So what happened was next, as Stephanie mentioned, these 3 working groups have been established, one on sanctions, one second on Iranians' obligations, and the third one about the practical implementation of the agreement. Working group has been set up a little later. So I briefly go through all these 3 working groups, where they stand now and what the possible outcome might be. In the first working group, sanctions, we more or less have 3 baskets. There's one basket, which is a green basket, where the sanctions which will be lifted, and there is an agreement on the sanctions that will be lifted. So these are mainly sanctions which, of course, nuclear related and have an economic impact and have been imposed after 2018. So Iran already announced priorities. So that's the oil sector, the financial sector, car industry, insurance industry, safety of shipping, things like that. So that's actually the easy part so far. It's not that easy because the Trump administration labeled many of the nuclear-related sanctions with different titles, like terrorism, missiles, human rights. So it's hard to entangle what is really nuclear-related and what is not. About 1,600 sanctions are imposed. So it's not that easy, but there is an agreement. The most difficult thing is the second basket. It is a yellow basket. There is no agreement yet, and that will be, there are the sticking points here. These are sanctions mainly imposed on individuals, not so much economic entities, but individuals. They concern mainly, from the perspective of the US, members of the Revolutionary Guards, but also politicians. Some of these sanctions are just stupid, like the sanctions on Foreign Minister Zarif, so they will be lifted. But there are other people of the Revolutionary Guards where the United States really don't want them to relief of the sanctions. So this is basically that I still have to talk about. And the red basket are the sanctions which will not be lifted. There seems to be already some kind of agreement, and Ambassador Soltanieh might correct me, but Iran might accept the sanctions which have been imposed before 2018 and are non-nuclear related. So that's what the Americans could bring home and say, we have not lifted all the sanctions. And I guess Iran might go along with the sanctions before 2018, non-nuclear related, this red basket. However, of course, it might be that one of the other sanctions of the yellow basket will be moved on to the red basket. I don't know. So second working group, Iran's obligations. So Stephen mentioned this already. These are the advanced centrifuges and the knowledge. So of course, Iran developed and enhanced this knowledge about its nuclear program, and you cannot undo knowledge. So the Trump administration should have known about this when he started the maximum pressure on Iran, that Iran will respond somehow in this overstepping its obligation and developing its nuclear program. So it's not really possible anymore to go back to 2015 with the same exact technology anymore. So the challenge is to restore the situation of 2015 with a mix of measures. So in these measures, in this mix are old centrifuges, new centrifuges, the amount of stockpile, the duration of the limitation. Nobody officially talks about it yet, because if you go back to 2015, of course, the limitations on Iranian nuclear program will last 5 years longer. So that's another factor. And of course, then there is the level of enrichment. So there will be some sort of mix and balance in order to restore the situation of 2015 without focusing on a single technology, like suggestions have been made that the new centrifuges have to be destroyed or shipped out of the country or something like that. As Stephen was referring to it as well. So you have to restore the whole balance here. So, so we have the third working group now, which is difficult because how do you now implement all this if you don't want a step-by-step sequencing? So which is not possible because it's cumbersome and painstakingly. And so one approach would be to do it in packages. So you do it in packages. You have one package, and the packages consist of Iran's obligations and sanctions relief. So, and if both sides have implemented the whole package, you can move on to the next package. So it's not a question who starts first. So the packages have to implement it. Of course, both sides have priorities, and maybe the easier package will implement it first, second, and third. So that would be possible to avoid this step-by-step sequencing. There's one issue what Ali mentioned, which is not, it's more based on good faith, because Iran wants the sanction relief to be verified. So you can't do it immediately after an agreement. So that would be, how can you do it? You can look at the amount of oil sales, for example, or the payments which come in. So, but this will take months. So it will already take until August, September, until the Jcpoa could be implemented. But until you can feel that the sanctions are relieved, it can take several more months. So that has to be based on good faith and cannot be implemented immediately by the decision or the suggestion of a working group. Finally, and I stop here, Stephanie, but because Stephen mentioned this issue, and I would be happy to talk about this more. I hold back for the moment. These issues, the leftovers by the Trump administration, the leftovers of the Pompeo 12 points that into the negotiations, the missile program has to be included, and as well regional behavior. These are all non-starters. These are all non-starters, and the delegations have been smart to say we don't address them in the Jcpoa. There's no arms control agreement which includes behavior, for example. It's stupid. But the Americans might want to have it addressed. So there will be in the agreement a clause which says we will address this issue later on in a different forum. So Here, Iran might go along with it and say, okay, we can do it in a regional context, regional arms control negotiations or something like that. So that might be a possible solution. So, Stefan, yes, stop here for the moment and I'm waiting for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Heinz. I mean, you also topped on very technical approach. Now, what is going on right now in Vienna? Like, how will the future might be looking? But you also asked a question to Soltanieh, so about what about non-nuclear related sanctions? And I also would like, just before we go into the discussion, because questions are already coming in, I would like, of course, also to give Mr. Soltanieh the possibility to react, since he was the first speaker, what the other speakers have been saying. But let me also already include one of the questions because it's addressed directly to you. And someone asks, what is the guarantee if the upcoming agreement will be respected and implemented? Will there be any mechanisms foreseen to protect the new agreement? So this would be the question, but please also feel free, Mr. Soltanieh, to reflect on what Stephen and Heinz have been saying. And then I look forward also to, it's also already in the chat, so the whole geopolitical security dimension, but please, the floor is yours, Mr. Soltanieh.
Well, thank you very much. I really commend both our friends, colleagues, elaborating very professionally to many aspects of it. I just give some comments, perhaps some sort of complementary one. First of all, Mr. Biden, what is trying and has to try, if on behalf of US and US nations expecting him, is to repair the damage by Trump administration to the credibility of US. Nobody in the world now trusts US to have any sort of agreement. And this damage is sustainable. It's not overnight. Therefore, I think that should be, and I think that American people expect him to put in his agenda. Therefore, whatever he's doing, even in Vienna, maybe it is in that line to some sort of remedy action to compensate the damage. The other one is, it is not, of course, easy to be the same environment of 2015. Be realistic. The situation is changed, and the damage that Mr. Trump did to sort of this multilateralism, trustful relation or so, is huge. It is not going to disappear soon. Therefore, you would not be surprised that we are not able to talk to US as Iranian did it in 2015. And therefore, this is part of it. And Iranian people will not accept, I'm sure, will not be able to digest that after all has happened, even the assassination of the Iranian hero, General Qasem Soleimani, all those, these are wounds on the hearts of Iranian people. Therefore, it will not disappear that soon. As I said, they should appreciate that still Iran showed its political will to the rest of the international community being in Vienna. The other issue, which are always raised, the issue of the missiles and regional and vis-a-vis the nuclear. Of course, all the participants of JCPOA already said that they decided rightly in 2015 and even now to not to put those on agenda because being realistic. But I want to draw your attention to a point. These two are different. Regional, yes, because we have been always for regional dialogue and reducing the misunderstanding. And as our foreign minister talked in Munich Security Conference, a regional dialogue in Persian Gulf, and also our president gave the proposal of the hope. These are indications that we are ready for it. But the situation should be prudent and the environment should do it. I give one memory just for you to for your distinguished viewers, which is relevant. After JCPOA, I was back, of course, in Iran, in IPIS, which is a think tank of a ministry. Munich Security Conference had a warning up a meeting there. And Mr. Steinmeier was there too, and I was present in that close somehow meeting. It was closed, I mean, not so many people were present. Therefore, I'm not revealing something secret. Mr. Steinmeier, after his talk, he said, by the way, after all good things about JCPOA, because the environment was good, he said, because of this positive environment, by the way, I'm going from here to Riyadh. it means that he was given indication that EU could play a role of sort of paving the way for dialogue among the countries in the region. Unfortunately now, if I want to compare that time, EU has lost its trust and Iranian trust and confidence because of lack of action, not being able to do anything after Trump's administration withdrawal, realizing the instincts a lot. I don't want to take the time. And also, of course, having the background 2003, 2006, that EU had really some sort of weak record, and they were not able to deliver what they promised. And in fact, EU3 passed us Iran to New York Security Council. Having said so, but the other issue is missiles. There is no international treaty for missiles. And Professor GÄRTNER have been always very logical. This is non-starter. This is a killing proposal and would go nowhere. We will never, ever will give missiles. I can tell you, if you have a poll in Iran, among Iranian people, that would be more than 90% say support missiles, because thousands of Iranians, including when I was in Iran at that time, saw that they were perished into ashes by Saddam missiles supported and provided by Western countries to them. Therefore, missiles is out of question. But regional, it might be a way, an issue that could be discussed, and depending to what extent EU could repair that confidence deficit, maybe they can play a role. Of course, we have to try ourselves among the regional countries for that matter. The other issue, of course, executive order. Yes, we expected that executive order should be given, and there was no necessity for negotiation, and we should be far away now. But unfortunately, we are where we are right now. Now, of course, there is another important point. Those in US and other in the region, which they are portraying themselves opposing the JCPOA, they are not honest. They're telling a lie. They were very happy that JCPOA was signed. I am among those I criticize that Iran has made too much compromise. And now, after years, with the unprecedented, most robust inspection in the whole history of IAEA. I've been involved with 40 years with IAEA. This is the worst, robust, intrusive inspection in the whole history of IAEA is imposed on Iran. Therefore, those opponents of the JCPOA, behind the curtain, they have celebrated for JCPOA and still want the JCPOA. If tomorrow Iran will announce that, okay, I'm going to go out of JCPOA, they will scream and they will, of course, harshly criticize. This is a reality. For 60% enrichment, I want to draw the kind of attention, our friends, that this is the application is for molybdenum, which is application for medical application. Therefore, 60% is not for the weapon. This is one important point, because I was in charge of that center and we were producing radioisotopes, and the 60% is going to produce radioisotopes, including the molybdenum. The other issue is to bear in mind that the Tehran research reactor, which I was in charge, American gave this reactor, was 93% enriched uranium. Therefore, even 93% enriched is not for the weapon. It could be for research reactors in order to have more neutron flux and better application. The other issue, of course, is the issue of the nuclear security and sabotage and, of course, cyber attack. I draw the kind of attention and refer all distinguished colleagues to go to Resolution 533 of 1990 of IAEA, which I was in charge, and this is I was honored to do it, and it was adopted. It says that any attack and even threat of attack against nuclear installations is a violation of UN Charter of IAEA statute and international law, and UN Security Council should immediately act. It is shameful UN Security Council has not done any action about a number of these attacks against nuclear facilities. And also nuclear security conferences, which was held in the summit and also in IAEA, and in a resolution of IAEA, condemn seriously any sabotage like it happened in Natanz, and therefore international community to do something, has to be something in this respect that they have not done it. And also the other issue was about sanctions. Of course, I'm not going to touch upon it because I'm not really the expert. I hesitate to do it. but I can tell you what is the sort of political environment right now in Iran. Sanctions should be removed. Of course, it has had impact on Iran, but it is not all that has had impact on economic situation. And we are insisting on resilient economy. And of course, sanctions should be removed, but not at any price. Therefore, this is not the issue that at any price, merely for the removal of sanction, we will make compromise at any price. This is something to bear in mind. And of course, the last but not the least is, I just want to inform and recall that we had the first, in fact, negotiation in order to prove to you that we are for negotiation. We had, for the first time in the history, before Jcpoa, in 2009, we had negotiation. I was head of the delegation in Vienna, organized by IAEA, negotiation between Iran, US, Russia, and France on the fuel of Tehran research reactor, which was historical. And recently, Harvard has published a paper. Mr. Poneman, who was the head of delegation, he was deputy minister of US, has in fact published that letter, and there was a webinar. Therefore, you can see what happened. And this was the first negotiation that Iran and US, in fact, were participating. Therefore, we have shown our goodwill and political will that we prefer negotiated solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soltanieh. Maybe we can already then also enter the Q&A section. And I mean, it has been touched upon by you, Mr. Soltanieh, and also by HEINZ about that missiles probably is not something Iran will ever give up. But nevertheless, the question is also, I mean, if missile is a non-starter, as HEINZ call it, how can regional actors be included in de-escalation? I mean, what does it mean for regional security? So how important is regional security, and how can regional actors be included? Maybe not with a missile, but maybe, Stephen, you can reflect a little bit on this whole discussion and also, what Mr. Soltanieh has been saying.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So I will kind of get to this and talk a number of different things kind of putting together. The first is I certainly agree with Ambassador Soltanieh on the concept of the Jcpoa and verification, that I believe that it was essentially airtight, waterproof, different layers of verification. And I think it was very clear that Iran was complying with the Jcpoa, and this is a mistake by the Trump administration. No doubt about that. We're in agreement on that. But getting to a couple of different things, kind of linking these things together, you know, one place where the idea of, you know, regional actors does come in, and we can talk about it, is missiles, which, you know, we've already said that this is a non-starter. We can talk about that a little bit more. And that is that, you know, the US administration worries about its own forces and interests, given Iranian use of missiles, ballistic and cruise missiles across Iraq and Syria, and also the fears of its allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. So perhaps, you know, if there's ever going to be anything related to missiles, this is possibly a, you know, long-term agreement and multilateral, but it's, you know, quite far off. And talking about ways to incorporate different actors into the region, into dialogue, I'll be very interested in a minute to hear from Ambassador Soltanieh on the Iranian perspective about ways that dialogue could actually take place with some of those actors in the region. Now, I'm very aware of the point the ambassador made about the Iranians and Saddam Hussein's missiles. I have a lot of Iranian colleagues, and this is a line that I often hear, and I think it's quite true, that during the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein carried out human rights violations, illegal targeting of Iranian civilians who were killed by Iraqi missiles. And so the Iranian view on this, my understanding is that these are a strategic deterrent and that they are necessary. Now, the American perspective is a little bit different, and it's not just a matter of, when I said, own forces, own interest, allies, and what they're worried about. The United States also lives with a legacy related to missiles, and that is the United States underestimated the timeline for the development of missiles and miniaturization and mounting of warheads on missiles of the Soviets, of the Chinese, and more recently of North Korea. Now, why should this matter? Well, the ambassador has made the point that, you know, the 60% HEU may have application for medical radioisotopes, and we know that to be true. It's absolutely true. But at the same time, there's kind of a sequencing issue. The announcement of 60% enrichment happens at the same time as the announcement of, you know, going over the cap on the quantities of uranium, increases in the number of centrifuges, increases in heavy water production, these things. And the point that I made at the very beginning in my remarks is whether or not this is intentional, the 60% is, again, decreasing the breakout time for Iran to get to the bomb. So that means that we have an interesting situation where in the minds, I believe, of American analysts, intelligence officials, they see a linkage between the nuclear program and the missile program as a potential long-term delivery system. Now, I think that in the event that the Jcpoa is back in force and that, you know, there are certain rollbacks in the Iranian missile program, I think it's possible in the long term that the United States is able to live with Iranian missiles. But one thing I also, you know, want to bring up quickly as well, too, is I think the things that we talked about, you know, missiles, perhaps the regional interest, are really interesting because they're the biggest, in my view, obstacles to long-term normalization between the United States and Iran. But dealing with them head on, I think, may backfire. And the difference of perspectives we've seen on this panel shows exactly why they may backfire. So one of the things I've been thinking about is, if not missiles, then what? And I've been thinking about, you know, and I've talked to a lot of people about kind of smaller initiatives. For example, the United States could potentially support Iranian investment strategies after sanction easement, such as in the field of alternative energy. And so let's say that the United States was willing to do so in the event that Iran's rhetoric in the non-aligned movement shifted a little bit and stopped being about nuclear latency, nuclear independence, and criticizing the nuclear suppliers group, and moved towards dialogue about, you know, collaborative NOM efforts on renewables and things like that. And I think that efforts like that, which are very small, would strengthen Iran's economy, make it a stronger, more diverse player in international markets. And I think that these types of things are small and don't seem like serious changes, but I think that together, small initiatives like this add up to potentially, in the long term, a relatively large shift in international positions, which might make it easier on both sides to reach further agreements. Again, I don't think that, you know, I think because of the security interest, I think that US administrations almost by definition have to talk about the missiles, have to talk about the regional interests, but I think they're more difficult to deal with. But what I would be very interested to hear is, again, is from Ambassador Soltanieh, who's mentioned that Iran might be interested in regional dialogue, peace, collaboration, and I'm quite curious about, you know, how that might work out and what you see is the possibilities there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Maybe, Heinz, there seems to be many questions about Iran's regional role, especially also after the Jcpoa. And Pantev also asks, is Iran tempted to use the Jcpoa issue in favor of the geopolitical competition of the USA, China, Russia, and European Union? Or maybe are there even other broader purposes?
Yeah, thank you. Couple of points to the debate before as well. So let me join both of the speakers to praise the Jcpoa. The Jcpoa, the best negotiated arms control agreement in history, with a comprehensive verification system, and it's permanent, so it's not expiring. So if you read the preamble says Iran never will acquire nuclear weapons. And you say that's a preamble, but the preamble is based on international law because it's enshrined on the resolution 2231. So all the debate about the sunset clauses, of course, some provisions expire, but not the agreement, not the agreement. So let me say that there's nothing what can better and stronger Jcpoa. There's nothing out there what is better and stronger than this Jcpoa. Of course, I can. Be made improvements. So that was, as I said, that was a non-starter to include missiles. and regional behavior. So we have to consider that missiles is for Iran can be a substitute for nuclear weapons. If you remove the missile defense, Iran calls it defense system, from their defense equipment, then Iran might consider to go nuclear as well, because somehow they would say we have to defend ourselves without missiles, then we have to do something else. But as Ambassador Soltanieh mentioned, there is no treaty agreement about missiles, but there is also no agreement which singles out one party if you address missiles. Of course, missiles are part of arms control negotiation agreements and treaties, like the START agreement. But it is a multilateral or bilateral agreement. It doesn't focus only on one party. So, and it's hard. The US cannot really export billions of weapons to Saudi Arabia and Israel and tell Iran to disarm missiles. So that's basically very difficult to sell in the region. And but I say missiles can be addressed. Missiles can be addressed in regional arms control negotiations. All the neighboring states should be included. Saudi Arabia's missiles already have a longer range with 2,500 kilometers than Iranian missiles with 2,000 kilometers. So there can be a cap on range. So there can be an easy agreement, for example, on that. Other conventional weapons might be included in regional arms control negotiations. Confidence building measures would be possible. So now this new rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia made it possible what Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif always stressed to establish a regional dialogue. So that seems possible. Concerning the geopolitical situation, the Trump administration and Israel and some Arab states wanted to set up these Abraham Accords as an anti-Iranian alliance, basically. So ignored the Palestinians. We see now that you can't ignore the Palestinians. So, but these Abraham Accords together with this Kushner plan ignored them. But now through a regional dialogue with Arab states and Iran, these Abraham Accords might take on another character and lose its character of an anti-Iranian alliance. That might be possible to do it in a regional cooperation. And to the enrichment debate we had before, so whatever the 60% are for, there were always a political decision before. So Iran started to enrich uranium to 20% in January 2021, when General Soleimani was assassinated. So started to 21. After Natanz attack, Iran started to enrich to 60%. So it was a response by Iran to a political event, to some incidents in the region. So it was not only for civilian purposes, it was to show we can do it also if you destroy our centrifuges, we can do it anyway. So how you do it, I don't know. I'm not a physicist, but it was a sign. So some conclude, oh, that Iran is going to be nuclear, going to have a nuclear weapon anyway, because now it's enriching, and that's the enrichment, as Director General of the IEA also said, that's the way to a nuclear weapon. The best response is the Jcpoa. So the Jcpoa allowed 3.67% enrichment. So if you go back to the Jcpoa, you can easily have a reduction of the enrichment as well. So, and as people from the IEA told me, it's not that difficult to go back from 60% to a lower level of enrichment. So that's not much of a technological undertaking to do this. So my conclusion is maximum pressure was a failure because Iran pushed Iran closer to the to a nuclear weapon. It pushed Iran to advance its missile program. It pushed Iran to strengthen its second line of defense, supporting some militias in the region, which might be addressed in the regional issue. So if you reduce the maximum pressure, all this can be, to take away the maximum pressure, all this can be also addressed. And there is no arms control agreement in history which includes behavior. So there's no behavior. If it included behavior, we wouldn't have any arms control agreement during the Cold War. On the contrary, arms control agreements have been seen as a success during the East-West tensions, that you get an agreement. So behavior, including in the arms control agreement, is just not possible. But you can do confidence-building measures, reduce maximum pressure, and you get the same result.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Since time is already running, I will probably also combine some of the questions, because there was, and of course it always comes up when we talk about Iran and or the US, it's about Israel. So one person asks he says we need a peace agreement with Iran and Israel, and how is this possible? And then there's also a question asking about what about the possibility of including Israel? I mean, probably, of course, not in a Jcpoa, but maybe in a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which also has been discussed. So the question is also a little bit about the role of Iran and Israel, and is there a peace possible? I mean, we know how Israel these days with Netanyahu is a little bit under pressure also from a domestic political point of view. But so about nuclear weapon-free zone, including Israel, and peace agreement between Iran and Israel. Who wants to start? Yeah, please, Mr. Soltanieh.
Very shortly, because of the time constraint, regarding the regional, of course, I reiterate that we have been always working and trying to have regional dialogue. At the end of the day, we have been and we will be thousands of years together. We are neighbors, therefore we have to find a way to have a peaceful relation as we had it before. One of the issues, I mean, one of the perhaps vehicles is the Middle East free zone that I am involved for the last 4 decades also. And Iran, in fact, proposed in 1974 and then later with Egypt. And this is an issue that has not been settled down. And we have been always dealing with the issue in the NPT, IAEA, and I've been working in this matter. And I'm honored that I'm a member of reference group of UNIDIR project on Middle East free zone, of course, for WMD. But for this issue, that is one of the possibility that Iran is ready, and we have been always very active in this Middle East free zone discussions in the context of IAEA, and now, of course, in the context of UN conference, which was held in also 2019. This is one of the things. Regarding Israel, I have to be very candid and frank and straightforward, because we shouldn't cheat ourselves, or you expect me to be very, in fact, honestly reflecting the realities on the ground. It is a matter of principle. It is a policy of Islamic Republic of Iran and many countries in the region that we will not recognize Israel because of the Zionist mentality and occupation. That is full stop. Therefore, there won't be any relation. There won't be any negotiation whatsoever. That's the only one in the whole world. We have negotiated with US ups and downs or other countries, but with Israel, it is impossible. This is the same as we had the same position after the revolution with apartheid regime of South Africa. Now we have, after this mentality is removed and disappeared, we have the best relation with South African country, government, and the people. Therefore, that is not possible. But in the context of a Middle East free zone, we have tried to find a way under the umbrella, I'm repeating, under the umbrella of UN. Whenever some people try to derail it, like Geneva process also after 2012, that I don't want to take the time, it needs books to write about it, because US will unilaterally in fact, stopped that historical conference, which was supposed to be in Helsinki 2012, upon the decision, unanimous decision of 2010 MPT, which I was in New York. Unfortunately, that happened. But after that, in fact, this is the situation that we were facing. In fact, we were facing some sort of a deadlock. But anyway, we try to put back again on that context, as long as it is under the UN umbrella, and all parties will be, of course, there. They can express their viewpoints, and we can take some steps. And myself had initiative for almost 10 years. That was non-attack against any nuclear facilities in the Middle East, so-called immunity of nuclear facilities in the Middle East as a confidence-building measure that I propose in different international fora. And still, I think that would be very important step. And we don't need any negotiation for it, so that the issue of recognition will come back again. UN could arrange a simultaneous memorandum and then announcement, and then all in the region will be abided not to attack nuclear facilities. The other issue is, of course, regarding enrichment. Let's be realistic. I'm telling you that, the truth, the scientific truth, and everybody, those technical scientists could admit, we are master of enrichment technology, and there is no restriction to go whatever, any level of enrichment. We are not for nuclear weapon, otherwise we could have done it. Therefore, they should not make a fuss of it, they should not make noise of it. We are determined not to go for nuclear weapon. We proved during the Saddam war, 100,000 Iranians were injured by chemical weapons. We didn't retaliate. And I was at that time ambassador in Vienna, and many chemical victims even were brought to Vienna for curement or so. Therefore, we have those memories in our history. Despite the fact that we could easily retaliate by chemical weapons, we didn't do it. We have fatwa of our supreme leader that nuclear weapon and even a mass destruction. He has repeated again and again in a NAM summit in Tehran that we are against weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, these are against our religious belief. And I can conclude by saying something. When I was in the 80s, Imam Khomeini, the founder of revolution, gave a lecture to the public that we are against nuclear weapon, and the people, scholars, scientists, and writers should uprise against Soviet Union and US nuclear weapon and destroy these nuclear weapons. And at that time, I, in fact, sent this text of the supreme leader that shows how the founder of revolution views is on nuclear weapon to the IAEA secretariat. Unfortunately, after a week, IAEA secretary wrote me a note that because of this text is not relevant to the IAEA, which is a shock, surprising, we couldn't distribute to the member state. Therefore, I decided to go to Maria Hilferstrasse and a publisher, and I published Christmas card with this language and distributed to the whole world. Therefore, I want to say that this is not today. From the beginning of revolution, we have been against nuclear weapon, but we are master of enrichment technology, and there is no way that we will give up this enrichment technology. I'm sure we have paid a heavy price for it. The only thing is Western countries, US, European, should cope themselves. We are ready to work together. And the last word is, there's the key for Iranians dealing with the West and the whole world. I've said it in my interview before. If anybody tells an Iranian, you must do something, the answer is no with a loud voice. If they say, please do something, the answer is yes, I try my best. And this is the key to any locked, in fact, deadlock. And it is what the Jcpoa has happened. When they requested us, appealed to us, we showed maximum concession. This will happen now in Vienna if that is the approach and the language in a decent, civilized manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soltanieh. Stephen, would you like to add something on the Israel question? And please then also already wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just make a few quick comments in just, like 2 minutes here. And that is that, one, I saw a few things in the chat that suggested that based on comments I made that I was possibly suggesting that Iran was trying to develop a nuclear weapon and it was kind of an open topic. I personally am not suggesting that. And my view is based on the 2007 US National Intelligence Estimate and based on the allegedly new Israeli, atomic archive from Iran. I think the evidence is very clear that I don't believe that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. I think anything research in the military dimension was halted a long time ago. Now, that being said, when Iran, and the point that I made before is this is a problem of misperception. And one of, when Iran does things like show that you have removed yourself from this deal, look what we can do, these are the risks, we can go to 60%, we can do other things. What that does is not everyone has the same view as far as Iran's intentions. And so that provides great ground for people who are anti-Iran, who are hawks against Iran, to say, hey, look, we knew Iran wanted to develop nuclear weapons anyway, and that's their interpretation. So what is the best solution here? The best solution is the JCPOA and verification that we've talked about, which I think will make it unequivocally clear, in my view, that Iran only has civilian nuclear intentions for the program. On the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone in Israel, I don't have a ton to say. The ambassador has worked on this for quite a long time, and I'm sure HEINZ has much more experience with this than I do. But the only quick few points that I would make on this is it's been very clear throughout the point of these new rounds of negotiations on the JCPOA that Israel, as well as other allies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have been interested in having consultations with the United States and are interested in playing a larger role as far as regional dialogue with Iran on nuclear issues. That's probably a good thing as far as it bodes for the future. But, on the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone, this is a tough one as well, because, the Iranian position being that they won't deal with Israel and recognition because of the Zionist cause, and the Israeli point that sometimes manifests itself in the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone context. It also manifests itself in the CTBT context as far as regional working groups, that they have conditions and they're generally not interested in participating in negotiations in which they won't be recognized on some level. So again, it's another really difficult impasse, and thinking about, who could be the mediator or moderator and what type of shuttle diplomacy and other things need to be done, I think is an open question. But thanks very much again, everyone.
Thank you so much. And HEINZ, last but not least, it's you maybe to give your last statement. And maybe also there is this question also still in the chat where someone suggests if the JCPOA should be renegotiated as a new agreement, because otherwise that the US would give away leverage and a new deal would allow to correct shortcomings of the JCPOA. This is the last question I'm taking up, but please also feel free then to wrap up and to give your last remarks today.
Thank you, Stephanie. Just a point of correction. I said before, Ambassador Soltanieh, I said General Soleimani was killed in 2021. It was killed, of course, in January 2020. Also a remark by Stephen before that the US should help Iran to develop alternative energy. It's a very good idea. I'm already supervising a doctoral thesis right now of an Iranian student. She should look what Iran has a potential for developing climate-friendly alternative energy resources as well. So it's a very good idea which has to be thought about the future as well. And then the nuclear weapon free zone. Of course, it's Iran and the Arab states are requesting it for years already. So it didn't really go off the ground so far. But there would be another possibility that might work as well if Iran and the Arab states might be willing to do so. Iran, of course, could join if it takes the nuclear weapon free zone seriously, the nuclear weapon free zone Central Asia. And if it gets negative security assurances, that means that the US would guarantee not to use nuclear weapons or threaten with nuclear weapons against members of the zone. So that would be the possibility that there would be a nuclear weapon-free zone from Mongolia with a little stretch, Chinese, Russian, down to Central Asia, Middle East, and that Arab states could join the nuclear weapon-free zone, Belindaba in North Africa. So what about Israel? Israel would be the only state with nuclear weapon in the region, but its rationale would disappear slowly, because if you're surrounded by nuclear weapon-free zone, the rationale to have nuclear weapons yourself is not really plausible anymore. Having said so, Israel already participated in arms control negotiations, regional ones in the 90s. And, but of course they broke down because of the nuclear question. But it is not excluded that to include Israel in regional arms control negotiations directly or indirectly in one way or the other. So regional issues are the way to go in terms of confidence building measures and in terms of regional arms control as well. So I'm now playing the devil's advocate, and that's my last word, Stephanie. So what happens if there will be no agreement in Vienna? So that's easy said, but what might happen is that Iran might enhance its nuclear program much further, probably not a nuclear weapons program, but close to it. So, then Israel might cry foul and say that's what we said all along. Iran is developing a nuclear weapon clandestinely. Iran might threaten to pull out of the non-proliferation treaty, maybe kick out the IAEA inspectors, and Israel would say now we have to do a military strike and involving the US. So no agreement in Vienna might lead to a very destabilizing situation in the Middle East. So it's much more than an arms control agreement. It's much more. It's about the stability in the Middle East and also about the economic well-being of the states in the Middle East, especially Iran.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Thank you very much, Mr. Soltanieh. Last word, please.
Just in 30 seconds, we do respect, this is the first time I'm going to disagree with my distinguished colleague, Heinz, Professor GÄRTNER. The proposal of Central Asia Free Zone or Persian Gulf Free Zone, which was discussed, it is a killer proposal to Middle East Free Zone. It means this is the best thing that Israel will be happy about, because Israel doesn't care what international community are concerned. Therefore, this will remove the pressure of international community for the last 4 decades on Israel. We have to all focus on Middle East Free Zone. That is one point. And of course, regarding the recognition vis-a-vis the discussion that Mr. Herzog said, I said it, I repeat it again. We are in the CTBT, we are in UN, and Israelis are their member. As long as it is under the UN umbrella, then anything could be discussed. Every party is expressing its viewpoints. Thank you very much.
So, but one sentence, Stephanie, just for correction. Iran wanted to join the nuclear weapon-free zone, Central Asia already, when it was established, 2002 something. But then it was not Iran, it was the US who prevented Iran to join, because the US would say, then we cannot address Iran's nuclear program individually. So we cannot blame Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. So it was the US which prevented Iran to join the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone.
I'm sorry, but still I disagree. And if my officials ask my opinion, I say, no, we shouldn't do it. We should only consider Middle East Free Zone. We do respect. Of course, I have my own opinion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. If it's not very important for you to have your extra 30 seconds, I will now conclude by thanking personally, but also in the name of the International Institute for Peace for your time. And I think also very, very good insights. You know, I think it's very important in all these contexts with all the difficulties to engage in a dialogue and to talk about the issues concerned. And of course, we always know there are always spoilers on all fronts. I mean, this is something on which is just part of our everyday life, be it in international politics or elsewhere. And nevertheless, I think it's also important to look at alternatives and also to see like what is actually the common interest. And I mean, it was also mentioned, we have all those now with the pandemic, with the environmental issues. I mean, there are always processes on which we can work together, which also might shape the cooperation in the future. And yes, that is it now for me. To Heinz, I will say maybe we should and we will definitely organize another event again, and also talking about more on the economic situation and the sanctions. Of course, also because of gender balance reasons, which we normally always try a little bit to engage in, which is of course not your fault in this. But thank you so much for joining. It was a pleasure for me, and have a nice day and hope to see you soon, maybe even in person. So we are quite optimistic with the Jcpoa, but also with normalization when it comes to personal life at one point. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much.